Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show that's all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. Since I've been spending a lot of time in the Chalice dungeons, I thought I'd start things off with a quick look at how my stats have changed, along with my general combat setup. I've gained 35 levels since the last episode of Translationborne, from 77 to 112, which puts me ahead of the curve as far as the main game is concerned, and I've mostly invested in Vitality and Arcane. Going forward, the plan is to get my Vitality up to 50, followed by continuing to boost my Strength, and maybe a little Skill if necessary to wield certain weapons for the Blood Gem special I'm planning to put together before the end of this playthrough. If I wind up leveling up enough to get my strength to 50, that's the point at which I'll essentially be getting the most out of the Tonitrus, and this offline strength arcane build will be complete. Speaking of weapons and blood gems though, I also wanted to mention how my combat setup has changed, because while I'm not sure how much this will come up in what's left of the main game, my time in the Chalice dungeons has helped give me a wider variety of options in combat. First, and most importantly, I've upgraded my saw cleaver and used blood gems to switch it over from physical damage to fire damage. This means that instead of basing its bonus damage off of my physical stats, it instead scales with my higher arcane stat. It also essentially makes this into a beast-killing weapon, because not only are beast-type enemies weak to fire damage in general, they also take extra damage from the saw cleaver in its normal form because of a hidden damage boost it gets as a serrated weapon. You can see that I've even given up some of the weapon's damage to kin-type enemies to use a more powerful fire gem. So what do I do if I want to deal more damage to kin? Well, I switch to my Tonitrus. Currently, this leans more into the physical side of the damage it does, as opposed to the bolt damage, but that bolt attack does help against kin-type enemies. Since it naturally scales with both strength and arcane, it also gets a bit more out of my current stat setup, making it good to use against regular enemies as well. Also, because I have my saw cleaver set up to fight beasts, I've got a gem on here that gives a larger boost to physical damage in exchange to dealing less damage against beasts. Finally, hunter tools like the Executioner's Gloves are starting to deal a lot of damage as a ranged option, which indirectly gets us to our first set of item descriptions. Garb of the Executioner Squad. Garb of the squad of executioners once led by Martyr Logarius. This is the foundation for subsequent church garb, and is thickly draped with a holy cloth. Martyr Logarius said this: "Good and evil are in no way related to wisdom and folly. Therefore, we alone should simply be good." So that's the chest piece, but there's also a slightly different line in the hand piece. Bracers of the squad of executioners once led by Martyr Logarius. The brass rivets are a characteristic design of the groups, as they are fond of hand-to-hand combat. And then there's one final variation on the leg piece. Trousers of the squad of executioners once led by Martyr Logarius. These became the foundation for subsequent church garb. Okay, so there are a couple of points I'd like to address regarding these descriptions, but I also wanted to briefly acknowledge that as I do so, we'll be making the rounds through Yharnam and its surroundings again to see how things have changed with the revelation of the Red Moon. Now, with that out of the way, I'd like to start by addressing a potential point of confusion here that can crop up in the English language version of the game. Remember how I mentioned the Executioner's Gloves as a ranged attack option earlier? Well, those Executioner's Gloves have nothing to do with the Executioners mentioned in this set of item descriptions. I can see why this would be confusing in English, and it's still somewhat confusing in Japanese, but in the original language, the difference between the names of these items is a bit more pronounced. Also, looks like the imposter doctor isn't answering her door. Anyway, the term for the executioner part of the Executioner's Gloves in Japanese is shokeinin, where shoke means execution, and nin means person. In other words, these are the gloves of an individual who kills people with the official sanction of a ruler. The Japanese term used for executioner in the Executioner Gauntlets, on the other hand, is shoke-tai, where shoke again means execution, and tai means band, group, or squad. This is the same organization the description specifies was once led by Logarius. So the Japanese is able to differentiate things a bit here by specifying that the clothing you can wear belongs to a group of hunters affiliated with the church led by Logarius, while the gloves you can use as an arcane weapon have been passed down for generations in a family of individuals who killed people sentenced to death by rulers, initially in an unknown foreign land and then later in Canehurst. But this presents a problem for the English. Before we get into it though, let's take a brief moment to mourn the transformation of poor Gilbert, who has presumably just died by our hand. Okay, so the problem with these two terms is that both of them kind of have to be called similar things in English. Obviously, the family of executioners should be referred to as such because that's literally their job title. Then you have this group that the Japanese refers to as the executioner squad in every instance. They get referenced in more than just this set of clothing, and they seem to play an important role in the church. As we can see from this set of items, as well as others we'll examine later, they're a group of hunters, they have their own leader, they have their own workshop, and they're also defined by their opposition to the Canehurst Vilebloods. In other words, it seems like this isn't just a band of people in the church who happen to carry out killings sanctioned by clerical authority, but are a distinct group calling themselves the Executioners. If that's the case, then the name of this group's attire should be based on the name they've given themselves. It should be the garb of the Executioners, or the Executioner garb. Calling it the Executioner squad garb instead is actually less natural. Imagine calling the Tomb Prospector garb the Tomb Prospector group garb, or the Choir garb the Choir faction garb. So the name for this attire makes sense, and the highly similar name for the arcane weapon also makes sense, but using them both renders the official English names for these items confusing. It's an interesting dilemma. Is it preferable to be less natural for the sake of clarity, or do you trust that the full description and different functions of these items will be enough to keep this from being a real issue? Alternatively, is there another name for the clothing set or the overall group that would make more sense? For instance, one option that might work would be to call the attire the Church Executioner set, but that may impact other aspects of the translation. With that in mind, we'll have to revisit this and other aspects of the Church's Executioner group as we continue to make progress in the game. That said, there's still one more part of this set's description I'd like to discuss, but first let's check in on Arianna. You look like you're in pain. Are you okay?
Oh, there you are. Forgive me, I'm a bit out of sorts. So, no blood today, I'm afraid.
Okay, do you maybe want something to eat?
Oh, there's something wrong with me.
Well, I hope you feel better soon. As far as the translation there is concerned, I think it's mostly straightforward, but there is one small issue with the English that arguably doesn't line up well with the current version of the game. Since this is all taking place over the course of a single night, Arianna saying, "No blood today, I'm afraid," could be seen as not fitting in with the timeline. The Japanese is safer in this sense because literally the term here is simply ima, or now. This isn't to say that today is necessarily a bad translation for ima. Sometimes the concept it conveys of the immediate future lines up nicely with the word today. And even as the line exists in English, we could take this terminology as symptomatic of Arianna feeling out of sorts. Or we could say the revelation of the red moon coincides with passing midnight, and therefore the start of a new day. Alternatively, from a more production-oriented point of view, it's possible this line made more sense in an earlier version of the game when perhaps the hunt took place over more than one night, though admittedly I'm not the most familiar with earlier concepts for Bloodborne. However you take it though, I think it's ultimately a minor issue, but I wanted to bring it up because it does tie in with the game's progression of time and the revelation of the Red Moon. So now let's go back to the final point I wanted to make about the Executioner set I'm wearing, which involves the translation of Logarius' saying quoted at the end of the description. Obviously, the formulation of the official English is quite different from the Japanese here, so let's look at them one statement at a time. In the first line of the original, two paired kanji representing the dualistic concepts of good-bad and wise-foolish are introduced, with the statement that each pair has no relation to the other. You can see this reflected in my literal version of good and evil are in no way related to wisdom and folly. The official English takes another approach, instead illustrating each part of the two dualistic concepts and challenging their conventional pairings. Acts of goodness are not always wise, and acts of evil are not always foolish. So the question we need to ask is, does this reformulation essentially boil down to the same idea that good and evil are unrelated to wisdom and folly? I would say yes, and I think the English formulation benefits from being more concrete. Moving on to the next line then, both versions are more straightforward about Logarius' group always seeking to be good. The two languages do use different transitions, dakara or therefore instead of but regardless, though I think the sentiments wind up being the same. Arguably, the Japanese boils down to, since both good and evil can involve either wisdom or folly, let us always be good. While the official English would be, though good can involve folly, and of course wisdom, and evil can involve wisdom, and of course folly, let us always be good. So despite the rewording, the core meaning is still being conveyed, and I think that makes this a great example of what's really important in a translation. But enough on the executioners. How about a vile blood weapon? Chikage, a foreign weapon used by the Knights of the Royal Guard who protect Annalise, Cainhurst's Queen of Blood. Its blade, which curves gently backwards, is engraved with complex ripples, and when blood is made to creep into them, it takes on the form of a bloody scarlet sword. However, that is a cursed technique that eats away at oneself. Okay, so as usual, there's a lot to discuss here, but the thing I'd really like to focus on is the name for this item, because it encapsulates a number of different issues in translation all at once. This might not seem obvious at first, especially since both my literal translation of the item name and the official translation call it the Chikage, but this is actually one of those issues all by itself. Here's the dilemma in the form of a question. When presented with a name in Japanese that has a meaning of some significance, is it more important to represent the Japanese sound of the name, or to represent to English speakers the meaning of that name? I touched on this way back in episode 3 of Translationborne when I used the example of how Pokemon names are often localized using meaning instead of relying on a transliteration of the Japanese, leading to names like Voltorb instead of Bidididama. However, sometimes taking this meaning-based approach might come across as inappropriate, or it may not adequately convey the foreignness of a given concept, or there may be some other reason why doing so would be seen as less than ideal. For example, when it comes to renaming a character in a work of fiction to preserve a pun in the original, often a translation will simply opt to convey the appropriate sound of the name because, well, that's actually how the character's name is pronounced. Now, obviously, Chikage isn't the name of a character, but there are a few reasons why simply taking the reading of the two kanji involved as its name makes sense. For one thing, it's clearly meant to sound foreign. In both English and Japanese, it's specified that this is a weapon from a foreign country. What's more, in the context of the Soul series, a curved sword that drains health from its wielder is likely to be some sort of katana analog. So using a Japanese reading not only makes the weapon sound foreign, it makes it sound like a weapon from some in-universe version of Japan, which seems appropriate. The other thing calling this weapon the Chikage does is it sort of helps to resolve another issue that comes up a lot in translation, which is dealing with double meanings. I say sort of because you already have to know a certain amount of Japanese to make this work, but for my own part, I can say that when I saw the name of this sword in English, I thought, Chikage. That must use the kanji for blood shadow in the original. That's because phonetically, chi is how you generally pronounce the character for blood, and kage is how you pronounce the word for shadow. In fact, we've already seen these kanji show up in the game before. Chi in particular is everywhere, but shadow notably showed up in the boss name Yharnam no Kage, or Shadow of Yharnam. Here's the thing though, these two kanji are not the ones used in the name of the Chikage. Instead, the first character means 1000, and the second character means view or seen. So the meaning-based name for this weapon would be something like Sword of 1,000 Vistas, or more literally, 1,000 Views. This could perhaps be understood as a poetic reference to the long distance the sword traveled to wind up in Cainhurst, but at the same time, the phonetic reading of these kanji is inevitably going to suggest the meaning of blood shadow to a Japanese player. This seems to me like a deliberate double meaning, perhaps suggesting that the sword's name was cleaned up a bit to be presentable in Cainhurst, while retaining an echo of the sword's true nature. Unfortunately, this is exactly the sort of double meaning it's hard to maintain in translation. Still, at least by calling it the Chikage, players who do know some Japanese will be able to have something of a similar experience. Overall then, there are a number of reasons I think calling this weapon the Chikage in English is the best solution to the various problems we've discussed. Emphasizing one aspect of this name over the other with a meaning-based translation would mean not only renaming the weapon, but completely losing some of what's going on in the Japanese. Using Chikage means that the blade will sound foreign, the English pronunciation will match the Japanese, and if the player happens to know that chi generally means blood and kage generally means shadow, it's possible that part of the implied meaning will come across in the English. Anyway, now that we've spent all that time talking about this item's name, I'd like to briefly acknowledge a couple things about its description. First, note that it seems to leave out some small details about the blade being slightly curved and the bloodwright being cursed, which could have been to save space or the result of an update to the Japanese or something like that. Second, this is another instance of a phrase I've literally translated as Cainhurst's Queen of Blood. It's going to be a while before I can go into my reasoning on that front, but you may want to keep that in mind. Now, I'm curious about why this light is still on. Is there someone else here that we haven't met yet?
You haven't by any chance seen my little sister, have you? I told her to look after the house. But she's run off somewhere. She's still quite small. And wears a big white ribbon. Have you seen her out there anywhere?
I kind of don't want to tell her.
Oh. Okay then. But if you do see her, would you give me word? She's a small girl, with a big white ribbon. My good little sister.
No, I think it's better if she knows.
Oh. Back again? Any news of my sister?
She got eaten by a giant pig.
Oh. How did this happen? Why would she ever go outside? At least I'll have something to remember her by.
Yeah, I'm real sorry about what happened. Well, it seems like she's pretty inconsolable right now. I guess it's not worth hanging around any longer. I can move on, get back to talking to other people.
What a perfect ribbon. And now it's mine. I can't wait to try it on.
Wait, did I hear that right? That was a pretty distinct change in tone.
Oh, it's wonderful.
Well, perhaps we're seeing another effect of the red moon. We've seen that Gilbert transformed under its effects, and lots of people who appeared to be on the brink of madness have all gone silent as well. It's possible that this girl's sorrow for the loss of her sister and her joy at gaining the ribbon are both genuine, brought on by heightened emotions and an abnormal state of mind caused by the low-hanging blood moon. Or maybe it's just emphasized the darker aspects of this new girl's personality, the two aren't really sisters at all, and she just wants that ribbon. But however you choose to interpret that short set of interactions, there are a number of interesting translation choices we can see here, mostly involving ways of conveying similar ideas from the Japanese into English without getting caught up on the literal phrasing. Most of these I'm a fan of, but there is one that I have some mixed feelings about, so let's go through some examples. To start off with, let's look at a set of translations that I really like. When you give the red messenger ribbon to the older sister, which is what I'll be calling her for convenience's sake, in Japanese, she opens with the phrase, "Ah, yappari." This term, yappari, is one we've encountered before that's usually a way of expressing that things have gone the way the speaker expected. Even in my literal translation, I've played a little into the context here by rendering this, "Oh, as I feared," because that seems more appropriate for confirming the older sister's suspicion that her younger sister has died. The official translation, by contrast, not only registers the girls taking in this information, it makes it sound much more natural by tying it into the next line. When the older sister says, "Oh, how did this happen?" there's no question that she's realized what's happened. She knows that the big white ribbon her sister wore being spattered with blood and handed to her by a hunter means that the girl has likely died or possibly transformed. So she's letting you know that she understands what you're handing her the ribbon means, she's expressing distress at this information, and arguably, based on the speed of her putting together what's happened, you could conclude that this was what she had been afraid of. Even if that last part doesn't fully come through, though, the phrase, "How did this happen?" leads beautifully into the next line, "Why would she ever go outside?" And I think that as a result of this second line comes across more naturally than it does in a more literal rendering, even though my more literal version is almost exactly the same as the official translation. Now, the final line of this short section is arguably the one with the largest discrepancy we've looked at so far, since "at least I'll have something to remember her by" isn't phrased anything like, "but now I can pray for that child." Still, I would argue the core emotion is preserved. The older sister is saying that there's something about learning the awful truth that is good, because with the ribbon she has a keepsake that will let her focus her thoughts on her younger sister now that she's dead. Of course, expressing those thoughts in the form of prayer is arguably different from simply holding on to a memento, but considering the change in tone that comes next, I think the official phrasing works pretty well. Of course she's happy to have this ribbon as a way to remember her younger sister, because she's happy to have the ribbon. That said, there is a translation I have more mixed feelings about that comes earlier, in the second line of the older sister's first set of dialogue. In the original, she says her little sister was supposed to take care of the house while the others were away, but is now nowhere to be seen. Meanwhile, in the official English, there's actually some additional information, because the older sister opens by saying she told her younger sister to look after the house, and then concludes that the girl must have run off somewhere. The issue here is that while it's possible to interpret the older sister's line in a way that fits the official phrasing, I think it's making a bit of a leap by specifying that it was the older sister who told the younger one to look after the house. And I think the reason this point sticks out to me more than the others is that this is an instance where, as I mentioned before, it feels like information's been added. It's not a huge change, and the switch to the active voice is nice, but I wonder if this couldn't have been, she was supposed to look after the house, but she's run off somewhere. This would have preserved the vagueness about who told the young girl to watch the place, and that might tie into the idea of the older sister being an imposter, since the younger sister we spoke to before never mentions having an older one. Overall, though, I think the translation decisions made throughout the set of dialogues do a great job presenting the information from the Japanese in a natural way. In particular, the treatment of otherwise generic phrases like, ah, yappari, and the interpretation of the thoughts behind the wording of others strikes me as inspired. I could actually go on listing examples, but I think I've suitably demonstrated the point, and I'm just about out of time for this episode. Let me just close things out by reminding you that if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for me, I would love to hear them, especially regarding the audio balance as I transition back from my Chalice Chat series. Anyway, I hope to see you next time, and as always, thanks for watching, everyone.